Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. I'm here, one of my writers, in this case Danny. Thank you so much, Danny. Has written me a script, The Tote Family Massacre in Walt Disney's Real-Life Murder Town. Holy shit, that's a hell of a title. Have I heard it? Walt Disney built a town called Celebration, and I feel like I did know there were murders there. Have I covered it? I haven't covered this on Casual Criminalist before, because I check that kind of shit. But I feel this feels familiar to me. Let's jump in. The floor of the show, I've never read this before. You and me, dear audience, we're going to find out about it together, so let's go. In January 2020, the Tote family disappeared. Relatives hadn't seen the family of five at all since December, and all communications had fallen suspiciously silent since a final text from Anthony Tote which explained that the family were all feeling under the weather, and quite a bizarre subsequent final text from his wife Megan, which was banging on about the impending apocalypse. Okay, we're all a bit ill, and the end of the world's coming. Uh-oh. That was more than a little out of character for Megan Tote. She and husband Anthony generally seemed like happy and down-to-earth loving parents who had both forged successful careers from their physical therapy center in Colchester, Connecticut. And life looked particularly peachy in 2019, from the outside at least. Oh wow, sorry, I just completely glossed over how recent this was. Then I don't know about this, because it was a longer time ago that I feel that I would know about murder in Celebration, Disney's town. Okay. Very recent Casual Criminalist today. I mean, 5 years ago, but still, compared to, we're often covering stuff from the 70s and shit. Although Anthony still spent the working week in their old swanky family pad in Colchester, he flew over to Florida the weekend to join the others who are now living the high life in the gated community of Celebration. There we go. A magical town originally dreamt up by Walt Disney as a throwback to the good old days of blissful innocence when you could walk confidently down the street without fear of getting mugged by your neighbors. Well, I don't know. Isn't this just called a safe neighborhood? I don't know. I live in a safe neighborhood. Odds of me getting stabbed just feel like zero. Fucking zero. It's just like old people and children. And it was here, in this enchanting town built on a foundation of nostalgia and plastic smiles, that the Todd family appeared to fall off the radar as concerns grew over the well-being of Anthony, Megan, and their three young children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe, and their beloved pet dog, Breezy. It would be a couple of weeks until that gruesome fate was discovered within the warm and cozy protective bubble of Celebration. The majority of the family had perished at the hands of the only Todd still standing, and it wasn't Breezy. Oh god, it's going to be the fucking dad, isn't it? It always is. No. I mean, allegedly. I don't know who it was yet. I'm sorry, Anthony, if it wasn't you, but it's just I've done a lot of these episodes, Anthony. Disney's master-planned utopian community of yesterday and tomorrow had already revealed a few cracks in its surprisingly sinister facade of frozen grins worn by wholesome neighbors wandering around in a daze as uplifting music is constantly piped out of the palm trees. Since the gates of the town were first opened in 1996, Celebration has witnessed multiple deaths in a nightmare pond of doom. Oh, that's what I know, yes! A resident getting embroiled in a standoff with a SWAT team with fatal consequences, and another elderly resident getting bludgeoned to death with an axe in their own home. In today's episode of The Casual Criminalist, we'll be looking in detail at the disturbing fate of the Todd family, whose bodies had been decomposing in the town for weeks before they were eventually discovered, and the subsequent bewildering trial in which the defendant couldn't seem to make up their mind about what exactly had happened to the rest of their family. But first, we should take a whistle-stop tour to the town of Celebration and examine the peculiar history of a spellbinding Disney dream which somehow became the unexpected backdrop for a horror movie that very much lacked a treacle-coated happy ending. Treacle, by the way, Americans, is what you call molasses. And I was always like, what is molasses? What is treacle? Apparently that's what treacle is. So there we go. Let's go fly a kite. Up to the highest height. What's that from? I mean, it's obviously from a Disney movie, but I can't. Oh, is it, the woman, the one with the umbrella. Mary Poppins. It is, right? It was Walt Disney himself who first came up with a blueprint for the utopian fairy tale city, although there would be a long wait before a revised version of his original plans finally bore fruit. Yeah, wait, it's 1996. Walt Disney was long dead. Way back in 1966, Disney had acquired tens of thousands of acres of land in Osceola County, Florida, most of which would be used for a proposed new Disney World resort, which would ultimately open to the public in 1971. But it also set aside around 5,000 acres of land in the southern side of the Reedy Creek Improvement District for another project that became known as the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, or EPCOT for short. Disney's original grand vision was for a futuristic city built on advanced technology, glorious capitalism, American dreams, and just a little sprinkle of pixie dust in which all the citizens would rent their lavish homes from Disney and work for the corporation. So it's basically like a company town. So Disney's describing a company town. They all think, oh, it's going to be wonderful. We're going to pay for everything with vouchers. And somehow it's some bizarre mix of capitalism and communism crammed into one place by a greedy capitalist. No offense, Disney. Love you. Do I? I don't know why I said that. But it just doesn't work out. It never works out. There'd be no buses or cars allowed within this climate-controlled dome sheltered from the rest of society, as everyone would get about town on state-of-the-art monorail which would stretch across the entire cinematic landscape. Some have suggested that Walt Disney's ultimate ambition was to effectively create an independent Disney government, which would enjoy full control over its own taxes and public services, and I don't know, probably its very own space program. First decree, no taxes for the Disney Corporation. But the problem, and a space program. The problem was that nobody else in the Disney company really shared the same vision as the Puppet Master. They most likely smiled with weak enthusiasm whenever Walt drew another picture of the proposed monorail, and they were all definitely up for the idea of the New World Resort in Florida. But the general consensus was that this whole EPCOT thing was as bonkers as pink elephants on parade. And so, when Walt Disney died of lung cancer shortly after unveiling an EPCOT promotional film, the project was quietly shelved for the best part of 3 decades. It wasn't until 1994 that Disney chairman and CEO Michael Eisner decided that it really was about time that the company tried to do something with those 5,000 acres of isolated land in the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Later that same year, Disney announced a $2.5 billion investment into the development of a new town, which would now be known simply as Celebration. Michael Eisner had clearly gone back to the drawing board with Walt's original plans, and there was no sign of the monorail or any of the more futuristic elements in this new, simpler and scaled-down reimagining of a utopian community. But it still bore some similarities to the element of the original blueprint that looked backwards to the good old days rather than forward to the nuclear apocalypse. Here's how Disney's own sales brochure pitched the idea of Celebration. There was once a place where neighbors greeted neighbors in the quiet summer twilight, where children chased fireflies, and porch swings provided easy refuge from the cares of the day. The movie house showed cartoons on Saturday, the grocery store delivered, and there was one teacher who always knew you had that special something. Remember that place? But that place is a made-up version of the past that never existed, Disney. You got your rose-colored spectacles on. No, but thanks for asking. Also, when is Bambi 3 coming out? Was Bambi 2? There's Bambi 2? Celebration was clearly meant to be a return to a time which may or may not have genuinely existed, a time when everyone felt safe in a close-knit community in which neighbors bothered to actually hold conversations with each other. It was a town of pastel-colored houses and elegant verandas, a town in which the pavements and driveways were always immaculate, and anything unsightly such as garbage cans or even cars were hidden away from sight around the back of the houses. A town in which those speakers tucked away in the palm trees regularly blasted out joyful tunes on a loop to provide citizens with a constant soundtrack to their daily lives. That is something that would drive me absolutely batty. I get upset by the music in the gym, and I'm just there for like an hour. It's like, for fuck's sake, if I have to listen to this song again, I'll kill myself. A town in which the front porches were purposefully positioned close to the sidewalks to force awkward interactions with your neighbors. A town in which everything you ever needed was within walking distance and all the shops closed no later than 5 p.m. so that everyone could go home and endure dinner with their families. My family in the UK used to have a house by the sea. We sold it last year, actually. And the area where it was located, when I was a kid, was not popular at all. And it was always like super quiet and nice. You could just look out on the sea and there'd be no one ever around. And then it became very hip and trendy. And so you'd be sitting out in your garden, looking over the sea, having a barbecue, having a nice old time, and fucking everyone there'd be just like streams of people. What about evening, morning, having a nice lunch, are we? Enjoy yourself? Nice house. And it'd just be like Bro, so often you'd just be inside with the blinds drawn, because no one wants this. No one wants that. I suspect it wasn't the best place in the world to pick up a doner kebab with all the trimmings at 3 a.m. But after the first residents began to move into their new accommodations in 1996, they discovered that they had to follow a pretty extensive list of strict rules and regulations if they wanted to keep their pad. They were forced to attend workshops on how to behave like respectable citizens. Jesus, if someone made me go to that, I'd be like, no, I am busy. Only certain colours of curtains were permitted, and only certain plants were allowed to grow in the garden. The height of the grass had to be kept at a certain length, and there were limits on how many people were allowed in a bedroom at a single time. Okay, hello. What do you think is going on? Children were either required to catch the bus to the slightly sinister school or scrounge a lift from their parents. One kid, who lived literally a few yards away from the school, got slapped with a detention for daring to walk just around the corner on foot. Meanwhile, Celebration filled with childhood obesity. Meanwhile, the beautiful 1950s style cinema, which was once considered the focal point of the whole town, refused to show anything more edgy than a PG-rated movie to prevent the adult population becoming corrupted by gore and naughty language. Bedknobs and broomsticks was considered just about acceptable, but your chances of watching Cannibal Holocaust were pretty remote. However, the weirdest thing about life in Celebration is that everything was so ridiculously fake, almost as if Disney were more interested in building a movie set than a functioning town. Depending on the season, a visitor may well have felt enchanted by the sight of a glittering ice rink, or the thick layers of snow forming on top of the houses, or the autumn leaves wafting around the pavements, or the sound of chirping birds in the trees. Wait, isn't this in Florida? Do they have seasons in Florida? I don't think they have snow. Is all of this really faked? That sounds like really expensive. It sounds like you're building fees or whatever you want to call it. You know, when you live in an apartment, you have to pay a certain amount to the communal fund. It sounds like it'd be really expensive. They're just piping snow onto your house. No. But the ice rink was just a sheet of plastic. The snow was shaving foam. That sounds horrible. The autumn leaves were imported, and the sound of birdsong was being piped from speakers between songs, presumably to make up for the lack of a DJ. Celebration was an artificial town, populated by residents who spent a small fortune on the privilege of being told exactly how to live their lives by Disney. You begin to wonder if the residents themselves were real humans or just androids participating in a mysterious Disney project with a purpose that is yet to be revealed. But the deaths were very real and most definitely not scripted. Darkness falls on Celebration. The first lives to be claimed were at the hands of the town itself rather than a human murderer. Celebration had now evolved into a living entity whose hunger for the minds and souls of the residents would not be satiated until it had devoured the entire community. Well, that's not technically accurate, but there were certain things that were a bit off about the layout. A massive pond was situated on the outskirts of town, which had the capacity to take newcomers by surprise. If you took a wrong turn in the car on your way out of Celebration, there was a significant risk of hurtling straight into the water, particularly at night. You got to put up a barrier then, Disney. Come on. And yet nobody at Disney had thought to erect anything as unattractive as a warning sign. That would do, to give drivers the heads up on the potentially lethal hazard right in their path. Thankfully, there's a sign on display there today, along with a whole bunch of big flashing lights. But there's a good reason for that. In 1998, 3 young blokes had been enjoying a holiday in Florida when they suddenly disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until sometime later that all 3 bodies were discovered inside their vehicle, lurking at the bottom of the body of water, which is now known locally as Death Pond. Fucking hell. Welcome to Celebration, the perfect town! Over here, Death Pond! Rumors have since circulated that the lives of many more missing persons may well have been claimed by Death Pond over the years, although in fairness you could suggest the same thing for any stretch of water bigger than a puddle. I'm surprised that Disney didn't avoid this whole problem in the first place by just installing artificial water in the pond. Yeah, it's just like a blue plastic sheet that kind of quivers. Yet, although Disney often copped the blame for accidentally developing a murder town, that's not entirely fair. They may have founded and developed the town, but they pulled out of Celebration long before the residents started bludgeoning each other to death with axes. The town was sold to investment firm Lexin Capital in 2004. Wait, didn't it open in 1999? It survived 5 years under Disney? Come on now. Much to the chagrin of some of the residents who felt that Disney had sold them a dream and then dropped them like hotcakes as soon as the last bits of real estate had been sold off and there wasn't much profit to yield from the land. Yes, it does kind of sound like that's exactly what happened, doesn't it? I mean, but come on, you got to expect something like this. It's Disney. They love money. It's what they do. And while Celebration is often described as a failed Disney venture, it sounds as if they didn't really do too badly out of the whole enterprise, ultimately making a reported profit of around $550 million, which is probably enough to fund both Bambi 3 and Bambi 4. Danny, I'm wondering again, is Bambi 2 a thing? You're alluding to Bambi 2. In contrast, Lex and Capital were left with quite a few expensive legal headaches, which can be traced back to Disney's original construction of the houses. Whilst everything looked bright and gleaming on the outside, the residents began to get a bit grumpy when the leaky roofs of their houses began caving in and the walls came tumbling down. Again, it seemed that Disney had been so busy painting the roses red that they'd forgotten to build structurally sound houses, and Lex and Capital were left to deal with the fallout. At least, you could still enjoy the fake dawn chorus getting beamed out of the bushes as your house crumbled to bits around you. The original fairy tale dream began to fade over the subsequent years as real-life problems seeped in through the cracks of Celebration. The town may have managed to shelter its pure and unworldly folk from the effects of grown-up movies, but it couldn't escape from the massive global economic meltdown which hit the US hard in 2008. The prestigious movie theatre closed its doors for the last time in 2010 and has been left to fall into disrepair ever since, whilst property prices plummeted by around 60%. Hundreds of homes were repossessed by the banks, and during one particularly bleak 6-month period, nearly half of all property sales in Celebration were foreclosures. Man, 2008, that recession was brutal. And it was as these black clouds began to form over Celebration that the town recorded its first murder. So Disney dreamed of Disney World, and he basically ended up with Detroit. Well done! 58-year-old retired teacher Matteo Giovendito lived alone with his chihuahua Lucy in a bottom-floor condo in a large complex called Idlewild. The neighbors had become concerned about Giovendito in late November 2010 as he hadn't been seen since just before Thanksgiving and his black Corvette was missing. Or maybe it's just because he's taken that magical monorail the whole time. This concern only grew when his neighbor and friend called around over the weekend to walk Lucy as usual, but found that Giovendito wasn't answering his door or telephone. The black Corvette eventually turned up around 10 miles away, parked near an apartment in the city of Kissimmee, but Giovendito hadn't made it quite that far. When the neighbors finally gained access to the property, they found that his body was on the floor where it had been left for several days underneath a blanket. Medical examiners later established that the victim had been strangled before he was struck on the head with an axe. Oh my god, Celebration literally has an axe murderer. What the f***? As far as I can make out, the chihuahua was unhurt. Detectives later uncovered a photograph of 28-year-old David Israel Murillo on the victim's PC. Murillo was a homeless man living in a wooded camp not far from Celebration who had initially struck up some kind of friendship with the retired teacher about a year earlier, although the details of the relationship were never expanded upon. But more significantly, his fingerprints had been found all over the condo, and when the police apprehended Murillo at his camp, they discovered a wealth of items which belonged to Giovendito, including his iPad and a stash of valuable collectible coins. Bro, you murdering someone and then, just keeping evidence? What you doing? Murillo admitted killing Giovendito, but also accused him of being a sexual predator who had spiked his drink before making unwelcome sexual advances. Since then, former pupils have come forward to accuse Giovendito of inappropriate behavior, although the full extent of this is still unclear. Murillo claimed that after he realized his drink had been spiked, he wanted to go home and went to retrieve his sneakers from a closet in the condo, but became furious when he realized that they were missing, something which he put down to Giovendito having a shoe fetish. Did he have a shoe fetish or did he have a foot fetish? Do people have shoe fetishes? It's oh, look at those pair of Nikes. No, I don't think so. Maybe they do. I imagine it's less than people with the old foot fetish, right? Whilst Murillo couldn't find his sneakers, he did come across an axe. And he later told reporters, "Something came over me and I felt so mad." He paused before adding, "But you can't justify that," presumably a reference to how he strangled Matteo Giovendito with a shoelace and then bludgeoned him to death with an axe before quickly making off with some of the victim's more valuable possessions. David Israel Murillo was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Some of Matteo Giovendito's neighbors reckon that this only happened because his victim had brought an outsider into the protective bubble of Celebration. That's what happens when you bring a homeless person into our perfect town. What was his name? Matteo? For God's sake! Meanwhile, another neighbor seemed strangely enthusiastic about this slight change to the local murder statistics. She raved to the media, "One murder in 14 years? Where can you go on this entire planet and find that type of statistic? Tell me, is that really a good how big is this town?" It might be significant that this particular neighbor worked as an estate agent selling homes in the town. She went on to say, "A couple of days after the murder, I got a call from a man up in New York who said he'd seen it on the TV news. He said, 'That's a great little town. 1 murder in 14 years? That's a good record. I want to buy a condo down there. It does seem a little odd that a fresh murder should inspire potential new buyers to check out local property on the strength of an impressively low homicide rate, which had just risen from 0 to 1. I don't know, if it is like a good statistic, that man just said, it's exactly the sort of thing I'd do. I'd hear about that, be like, wow, that's actually really good. And I bet prices are going to nosedive, at least short term. Now's a good time to get in. That's how my logical brain works, and I get the feeling this dude is the same way. Those statistics were destined to change quite dramatically, though, before the decade was out. But just before we get to the Todd family's ill-fated arrival to Celebration in 2019, there was another alarming incident which occurred literally a few days after the murder of Matteo Giovandito. As the community was still reeling from the news that one of their neighbors had just been killed with an axe, the usually cheerful ambience of the town was disturbed once again when a SWAT team burst onto the scene, accompanied by a tank and several helicopters juddering over the candy-colored houses. 52-year-old Craig Fossey was a former transatlantic jet pilot who had been going through something of a difficult period following a separation from his wife and the bankruptcy of a new security business he'd recently been developing. His estranged wife alerted police to Fossey's threat that he now intended to kill himself within the walls of his own Celebration townhouse in a cul-de-sac named U Court, and subsequent calls to Fossey's cell phone confirmed that he was armed and ready to take his own life. Okay, fine. A SWAT team, a tank, and helicopter seems like a little bit of overkill here. Maybe someone should just go along and be like, you alright, mate? Is everything alright? Like with a megaphone so they don't get too close. Being like, come out here, we can talk. Come on now. Rather than like, SWAT, motherfucker! As fears grew that a man at the end of his tether was brandishing a gun, the local school just around the corner went into temporary lockdown as the SWAT team arrived at Fossey's house in an attempt to talk him down, a situation which evolved into a 14-hour standoff. Fossey had barricaded himself into his home, but he initially indicated to the SWAT team via intense negotiations held on his cell phone that he fully intended to emerge from the house when he was ready. However, he would not emerge from the house alive. Instead of talking things through calmly with the SWAT team, he actually started taking pot shots at them when they attempted to get a small robot into the house to record footage of Fossey's movements. This all seems like incredible overkill. He was just planning to kill himself, and now it's turned into a proper standoff. It went from him not committing any crimes to being like, holy major crimes. None of the team were seriously hurt and no shots were ever fired back. But after Fossey fell silent for a couple of hours, the SWAT team eventually used tear gas to gain access to the house during the early hours of the morning and discovered that he'd carried out his threat. Craig Fossey had died from a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. A couple of years earlier, a happy resident joked that the perfect world of Celebration wouldn't feel like a proper town until it had recorded something as dramatic as its first bicycle theft. Now, within that very same tumultuous week, the community had witnessed an axe murder and a violent death, both of which must surely have been in direct violation of at least a handful of community guidelines, which were getting bandied about during those handy workshops on how to behave like a model citizen. By the end of the decade, though, they would have to come up with a whole new rulebook. This is a lot in 1 week. Jesus Christ. An axe murder and a standoff with SWAT ending in a suicide. God damn. Introducing the new neighbors. Anthony Todd and his family moved into their rented accommodation in Celebration in 2019, a big step which they likely viewed as yet another milestone in their increasingly successful and prosperous lives. The Todds were a family very much on the way up. But Anthony hardly had the best start in life, following a horribly traumatic incident that occurred in his family home when he was just 4 years old. Born in 1975, Anthony was raised in the township of Ben Salem in Pennsylvania by his mother Loretta, who had worked at the local hospital, and his father Robert, who was a special needs teacher and wrestling coach at the local high school. Younger sister Chrissy completed the lineup that was perceived to be a happy family of 4. Yes, this sounds like your very typical average family. What happens? But an incident that unfolded in the very early hours of one morning in 1980 changed everything. Dad Robert wasn't home when an intruder, later identified as 19-year-old John Chermont, broke into the house with relative ease. And what with Robert Todd being a wrestling coach, it might be considered a pity that he wasn't around to stop what happened next. Chermont initially started rifling through drawers and stuff, as you might expect from a typical burglar, but he wasn't actually interested in stealing anything at all. This was just a ruse to make him look like a typical burglar. Armed with a gun, John Chermont only had one mission that night: the murder of Anthony's mother, Loretta Todd, as she slept soundly in her bed. What the fuck did Loretta do? Not that she's the victim here. I'm just curious what led to this situation for what seems like an entirely normal family. However, Chermont wasn't the most professional or experienced assassin in the world. He probably wasn't even the most professional assassin in the neighborhood. For starters, he was already blind drunk by the time he entered the house. That's one of the rules, dude. Don't do crimes while you're drunk. Especially like mega drunk. A little bit of Dutch courage, I mean, sure. But like getting blind drunk before you go murdering? Fucking terrible idea. And as he made his way to the bedroom in which his target was sleeping, he clumsily stumbled into something which immediately awoke Loretta and prompted her to sit upright in bed. Sensing it was now or never, Chermont raised his gun and shot Loretta Todd in the face before stumbling back out of the house, pausing only to vomit on the front lawn. The bullet had pierced Loretta's eye and lodged in her skull close to the back of her brain, where it remains to this day. Holy shit! He shot her through the eye, and it is in the back of her head? Although she lost an eye for the ordeal, she was considered incredibly lucky to survive. Yeah, no shit. She got shot in the face! There had been just one witness to the attack, and that was 4-year-old Anthony Todd, who had been woken up by all the drunken bungling, had been standing on the top of the landing as he watched his mother getting shot in the face. It's believed that Chermont had observed the young boy, but had simply picked him up and put him back in bed before making his vomit-drenched exit. He was under strict orders not to hurt anybody else in the house. Oh, so he's actually an assassin. Sorry, I thought that was just like, not a joke, but like a throwaway comment. He's been hired by someone? What the fuck's going on? Young Anthony was said to have suffered nightmares about the incident for years afterwards. Yeah, no shit, dude. That's the sort of thing you still have nightmares about as an adult. Like, if I saw that when I was 4, I'd probably still have nightmares about that. No doubt, I still have nightmares about the most stupid shit. But the family had a more immediate nightmare to deal with as John Chermont's motives gradually became clear. The police had only identified Chermont as a suspect after he was arrested on a completely unrelated charge, and he eventually admitted that he'd taken on the role of novice hitman working for a higher authority. He'd been ordered to kill Loretta by her husband, Robert Todd. Holy shit, it's always the husband. It turns out that Robert's life had become a bit complicated in recent years, as the married man had not only become engaged to a much younger nurse in a nearby town, he'd also struck up another relationship with a girl of just 17. Uh-oh. It's believed that there may have been a long list of other relationships on the side, which were never discovered. But as he was now a man, not so much living a double life, but more a whole multiverse of different lives, he'd reached the decision that things might be easier if he took his wife and the mother of his 2 children out of the picture. How about divorce? How about that instead? Rather than depriving people of their mother, you piece of shit. And also their father, because you're going to prison, my dude. The schoolteacher clearly didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he enlisted the services of one of his own former special needs students, John Chermont. While Robert Todd had continued to wrestle with his current students, John Chermont only wrestled with alcohol and drug addictions after leaving school, and he already had a criminal record. Robert had described the target to Chermont as a particularly troublesome babysitter rather than his own wife. But Chermont didn't seem that keen on taking up a new career as a hitman. The original plan to take out Loretta in the hospital parking lot as she tried to get into her car after finishing work was scuppered at the last minute when Chermont got cold feet and ran back home instead. Robert eventually decided that it would be easier to just give Chermont the keys to his house and to order the hit for the early hours of the morning when the supposed nuisance babysitter would be asleep in the master bedroom. At the time... What sort of babysitter sleeps at your house in the master bedroom? Like, what's going on? This time, perhaps spurred on by excessive alcohol consumption and the promise of a pretty paltry $800 to help fund his own next hit, Chermont did attempt to kill Loretta, but thankfully didn't quite succeed. It's believed that Robert was probably hovering very close by to the scene as his hitman paid a visit to the family home. In return for giving testimony against Robert Todd, John Chermont was promised and given a prison sentence of just 4 years for his botched role in the murder plot. Dude, that's crazy. 4 years? You attempted murder someone. You shot someone in the eye. Meanwhile, Robert Todd always denied having any part in it. During his trial, the prosecutor, Alan Rubenstein, wrapped up the case by urging the jury not to be misled by Robert's charm and charisma. He warned, he can be acquitted, and he can be set free. All he has to do is fool the 12 of you. Clearly bristling at the idea of being taken for fools, the jury found Robert Todd guilty of attempted homicide, criminal conspiracy, and criminal solicitation. His original prison sentence of 20 years was later reduced to 10 years on appeal. You hired a hitman to kill your wife. America normally it's like, and then he got 706 years in prison. And today it's like, no, he's out in 10. What the fuck, America? But it's gut-wrenching to note that Loretta initially point-blank refused to believe that her husband was really the mastermind behind the plot. In fact, Robert continued to live in the family home right up until the point that he was sentenced to prison, and Loretta had been fiercely protesting her husband's innocence throughout the trial, and indeed for a little while after the conviction. Loretta eventually accepted the version of events presented by the prosecution and moved on with her life. She moved to Connecticut and remarried a nicer guy who wasn't secretly trying to kill her, and who became a good stepfather to Anthony and Chrissy. Well, that's very nice. Robert Todd served his time in prison and is still pretty active on social media today, although he has had no contact with his children for years, admitting that he pretty much gave up on his position as dad after the new stepfather stepped up to the plate. Well, honestly, if I'm that kid, it's like, do you want to go see dad, who shot me in the face? I'd be like, no, mum, not really, but thanks for offering, appreciate it. No, no, dad's a psycho, allegedly. As for young Anthony, the nightmares had continued for a child who was clearly traumatized by the sight of his mother getting shot and the later discovery that his father had ordered the hit. But the nightmares didn't last forever, and in later life, Anthony Todd's life in Connecticut became something of a success story. He trained for a while at the fabulously named Gaylord Rehabilitation Outpatient Facility before launching fabulously named his own physical therapy practice in the town of Colchester, where he worked on training athletes as well as sorting out regular patients with their aches and pains. A quick nosy through his company's old Facebook page suggests that the practice boasted a long list of very happy customers. Here's one typical review from 2019. Anthony is the absolute best. He really cares about everyone who walks through the door, and he helped me so much with my foot pain. He's a good human and an amazing PT. The good human, Anthony Todd, had also hooked up with girlfriend Megan in college, who would later become his wife and mother of the couple's 3 children. Megan had worked as a yoga instructor before moving over to physical therapy and becoming a partner in what was now a prosperous family practice, which expanded into a second clinic in the town of Westchester. The Todd family were clearly big fans of Mickey Mouse as they took the kids on frequent trips to Disney World, and business was doing so well by 2019 that they decided to rent a 3-story house on Reserve Place in the very town that Disney built. Anthony still lived in the old family home in Connecticut during the working week, but he flew back to Florida to spend the weekends at their new home in celebration with Megan and the 3 children, 13-year-old Alec, 11-year-old Tyler, and 4-year-old Zoe, and of course the family dog Breezy. The Todds were often painted as the happiest and most loved up and most energetic family on earth. Anthony and Megan's Facebook pages regularly shared photographs of the whole family enjoying thrilling holidays, attending summer music programs, dancing around the Christmas tree, and mucking about in fancy dress costumes. Anthony was described by former friends and neighbors as a cool guy with a great sense of humor who was always keen to get involved with the local community and regularly volunteered as a youth soccer coach. Yeah, but this is like social media, right? It's always presenting the best side. I don't do so. My wife and I, we just don't do this stuff. And I think it's much better that way. Like, the people sharing too much, and I know that's most people, so I sound like a bit of a dick, or like pretentious or whatever. But it's like, I don't know, just enjoy yourself. You don't have to share every moment. Like, sometimes I go out for dinner with mates or whatever, and they'll be taking pictures of the food and stuff. I'm just like, for what? Why? What are we doing? It's weird. Just enjoy it. Youngest child Zoe was a ball of curious energy, whilst the boys Alec and Tyler were both accomplished piano players, avid bookworms, and keen soccer players who didn't mind rolling around in the mud. Breezy probably liked chewing socks. But behind closed doors, both Anthony and Megan had also endured a rough time in very recent years. Megan was always described as a bubbly, loving person who lived for her family, but she recently experienced devastation of a second miscarriage. She was also suffering from ill health after contracting Lyme's disease from a tick bite during one of the family's many trips to Disney World, and she went on to endure painful long-term complications from the disease. Yeah, Lyme disease sucks. Like, that's one of those ones that you don't really, like, I'd never really heard much about. And then I found out about Lyme disease, and I'm like, man, that's not nice. Now I'm vaccinated against Lyme disease because, like, it's like a lot, you can have long-term from Lyme disease. I once knew someone who was like, they'd been so affected by it. Like, they'd become, like, slower than they were because of Lyme disease. It's nuts. This may explain why Anthony was the only one traveling to work in the week, as Megan had called time on her role in the physical therapy practice and elected to stay in celebration to homeschool the 3 children. Anthony had started to pile on quite a bit of weight and was later diagnosed with diabetes. And whilst the family were usually described as lively, outgoing souls, there were some claims from their new neighbors in celebration that the Todds were becoming increasingly withdrawn and isolated. Anthony may not have been able to hide his weight gain and his diabetes diagnosis from Megan, but he was still managing to hide a pretty explosive secret from his family throughout the later part of 2019, and that's that everything had gone to shit. Although Anthony was still traveling to Connecticut every week, it's not entirely clear what he was doing when he got up there. Oh no, is he pretending his business has gone under and he's just like, oh no, I can't tell anyone, so I just have to go there and sit around in a park. Jesus. His license to practice physical therapy expired in September. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have thought this would have been a massive deal, as it only seems to cost around a couple of $100 to renew the license, with perhaps a bit extra tacked on if you've allowed it to lapse. But a couple of $100 may well have been a big deal for Anthony Todd at the time. It seems that business hadn't been doing quite so well after Megan had stepped down from the practice, and Anthony had been struggling to keep his head above water. Perhaps if he'd not been buying now largely pointless flights to Connecticut every week, he might have saved enough cash to renew his license, but the financial problems ran way deeper than that. I don't know, about the finances and stuff, I'm always super open with my wife about this stuff, because otherwise it's I don't know, you just don't mention something one time because you're like, oh, it's nothing. And then you're like, oh yeah, but what if it becomes more of a big deal? And then it's harder to say. So I'm always we talk about money pretty openly, because I think it's I don't know, you don't want to get in that situation where you're just everything's fine and it's not fine. You just want to be everything's not fine, and then you can deal with it together, which is way better than just lying. Anthony had taken out 2 loans from a couple of different creditors, totaling just short of $100,000, but after failing to meet the monthly repayments, he was now being sued by both of the loan firms. It's probable that he was also failing to make the repayments on a whole string of other smaller loans. But Anthony had come up with an interesting new way. Oh no, he's going to do the life insurance thing and murder his family. Allegedly. Oh God. Of trying to raise some much-needed funds during this challenging period. He had decided to send regular bills to medical assistance programs such as Medicare, seeking money for treatments that his patients had never actually received. Oh no! Well, I mean, it's much better than murdering his family for insurance money, but he's committing fraud. This is a bad time, dude. This is you're gonna get in real. This isn't not repaying a loan. This is fraud, my dude. It's alleged that Anthony had received tens of thousands of dollars from Medicare alone in return for months of work that was never undertaken. But instead of paying off his debts or even bothering to renew his physical therapy license, he plowed all of this money into more family holidays and a ridiculously expensive new rented home in Celebration. Perhaps the medical assistance programs had begun to grow suspicious when they saw that Anthony had somehow managed to bill them for a total of 36 work hours in a single day. What, you're not even good at fraud, dude. That might have not been so bad if the day in question hadn't been Saturday when his clinics were closed. Dude, really? Can you really be that bad at fraud? Just make a little bit of effort. Anthony was placed under investigation by the Connecticut Office of the Attorney General on suspicion of breaching the False Claims Act. Following a raid on his Colchester branch, he initially denied all accusations of fraudulent activity, but eventually admitted that he might have made up 1 or 2 hundreds of things here and there. He also stressed that neither his family nor his soon-to-be ex-employees had any awareness of the devious scheme. Whilst all this was going on, the landlords of both the business locations in Colchester and Westchester had placed eviction notices on the properties, claiming that they hadn't received any rent for the previous 2 months. It's firmly believed that Anthony Todd hadn't revealed any of this to his wife Megan, who was now under the impression that the business was still going fine and dandy and that her husband was still very much behaving like a good human. But towards the very end of 2019, another problem emerged, which Anthony was going to find rather tricky to keep secret. The financial situation was now so bad that he had been missing the rent payments on the house on Reserve Place in Celebration, and following the filing of a complaint for eviction against the Todds, a court summons was sent to the house on December the 26th. However, it had been around Christmas time that the whole Todd family had already fallen strangely silent. By January 2020, some of Anthony's family members, including sister Christy, had become so concerned about the whereabouts of the family that they launched a Facebook group entitled Looking for the Todd Family. It was explained to the group that nobody had heard from the Todds since a couple of worrying text messages received from Anthony and Megan in early January, and relatives were becoming increasingly anxious over their welfare. The group swiftly attracted a pretty impressive 2,500 members over just a few days, with many friends and neighbors reporting on the last sightings of the family whilst expressing hope that they would be found safe and well. A woman who described herself as a dear friend of the Todds posted a message in which she explained that she felt Anthony had been going through a rough time recently. A close neighbor at Celebration assumed that they'd just gone on another holiday, as the blinds in the house were all drawn and decorative pumpkins were still out on the lawn from last Thanksgiving. Don't you mean decorative pumpkins? Wouldn't that be Halloween? One former customer sensed that Anthony was becoming increasingly stressed, whilst another customer explained that all of her upcoming appointments had been very suddenly cancelled and that subsequent attempts to reach out to Anthony had been met with no response. It feels a little odd that whilst over 2,500 people were expressing their concerns on a Facebook group, nobody at all had taken the step of filing a missing persons report. Oh, really? I just assumed that had been done as well, but adults going missing's, well, there are kids, aren't they? There are kids there as well. It's weird that no one did that. I just assumed that it happened and the Facebook group was another thing. Some may have argued that whilst the family were a little puzzled as to why the Todds had gone so suspiciously quiet, they weren't exactly consumed with anxiety, as it was largely assumed that the family had probably just taken yet another vacation and gone off-grid for a little while. Months, though? Wasn't it January? From like October? Halloween? That's like 3 months, 3 months. No one goes on holiday for that long. I mean, unless you're like retired and shit. But those final text messages suggested something else might be going on. To be fair, although no missing person report was filed, relatives had taken a step of asking the local authorities to check in with the Todds at their home in Celebration at the very end of 2019. But the authorities had quickly given up after reaching the conclusion that nobody was at home and there was nothing suspicious to report. Shortly afterwards, on January the 6th, Anthony Todd's final text message to his relatives explained that the family were all feeling sick from the flu, but gave no indication as to their whereabouts. A few days later, on January the 9th, federal agents who had been investigating Anthony Todd's alleged fraudulent activity called round the house to have another quiet word in his ear, but nobody answered the door. It was only after this fruitless visit that the relatives received the final text message from Megan Todd, which raised more than a few alarm bells. Instead of offering any reassurances as to the family's well-being, she just rambled on about how the end of the world was nigh and that everybody on Earth was doomed. Although the text was deeply baffling and only heightened concern, it also presents another reason why no missing report had been filed. Although the Todds hadn't physically been seen for a while, they still appeared to be making contact with their relatives. Yes, someone is. Not necessarily them. So someone's just got their phones. That's a bit weird. I had a scare the other day. My parents are right now on holiday in South Africa. And there's, it's like not the safest country in the world. And they're out there for a month. And I'm in the gym, just working out with my trainer, just having a time. And I get a phone, I get like when your phone's on silent, but Apple still push you a notification. You're like, oh, okay, hello. And it's like urgent. You're listed as the emergency contact for my dad, and they've just dialed the emergency services from this location. And I'm like, what the f? So I phone my dad's phone, and it's off. And I phone my mum's phone, and it's off. And I'm like, what the f is going on? And then I call my dad's FaceTime. And he answers, and he's like, hello? And I'm like, everything all right? And he's like, yes, fine, why? And he's like, oh, no, I'm sorry, I just accidentally called a pocket dial or whatever bullshit. And I'm like, okay. Scared me. It's like, not good. I was like, what the f? And my trainer's like, everything all right? And I'm like, yes, my heart is now beating fast, but everything's fine. It wasn't until January the 13th that the fate of the Todds was finally revealed when federal agents made a return visit to the house with the intention of arresting Anthony Todd on healthcare fraud charges. And this time, there'd be no mucking about. They'd obtained the keys from the landlord and they were going to get inside the property, whether somebody answered the door or not. Discovery at Reserve Place. The first thing that struck the unfortunate federal agents and the deputies who entered the house was the utterly foul stench that seemed to emanate from every crook and cranny of the building. It was enough to make several of the officers feel sick with nausea as they took their first step past the threshold. The second thing they noticed was Anthony Todd up on the second floor, attempting to make his way down the stairs to greet the officers. Don't mind the smell, officers. Everything's fine. Just the freezer's gone out. Oh, dude, my freezer went out. That shit doesn't smell good. Like, you just open that and go, whoa, hello. He didn't look in the best of shape. He was shaking and trembling whilst mumbling incoherently and holding weakly onto the railings for support. When asked about the whereabouts of the rest of the family, Anthony mumbled that he thought the children were stopping at a friend's house for a sleepover, but Megan was upstairs asleep in bed. At this point, he called out to Megan, but as you might have already suspected, there was no response. What are you up to? You must have lost your mind to think that you're just gonna, pull the wool over these dudes' eyes. Several officers ran upstairs to check out the rest of the building and walked right into a stomach-churning scene in the master bedroom. The decomposing body of 42-year-old Megan Todd was lying on the bed, covered in blankets. Two more bodies had been placed on the mattress on the floor and were covered up with blankets alongside the remains of pet dog Breezy in a dog bed. The two bodies on the floor were later identified as 13-year-old Alec and 11-year-old Tyler. Da fuck, dude. It took a while for the officers to realize that there was a fourth body in the room. The decomposing remains were so small. The body of 4-year-old Zoe was eventually found at the bottom of her mother's feet in the bed, again covered with a blanket. Oh, the bodies were badly discolored and had clearly been left in the room for at least a couple of weeks. They were most likely killed at some point around New Year's Day, and the decomposition was so advanced they could only be officially identified by dental records. Fucking hell. It was later determined by the Orange Osceola County Medical Examiner's Office that all 4 members of the family had been given overdoses of Benadryl, and all except Zoe had been stabbed. Megan had been stabbed twice in the stomach, and Alec and Tyler had been stabbed once in the abdomen. But it was impossible to pinpoint the exact cause of death. Suffocation may or may not have been a factor, and we can speculate that the family were most likely heavily drugged before 3 of them were stabbed and Zoe was suffocated. But the autopsy report could only conclude that the family members died as a result of homicidal violence of unspecified means in association with diphenhydramine toxicity. I assume that's Benadryl. So all of this presents a pretty grim picture in which a financially floundering Anthony Todd had somehow come to the conclusion that it would be better to murder his wife and 3 young children than to come clean about the fact that his business had sunk and he was now under investigation for fraud. This is why you've got to be... This is why you've got to be open with your spouse, because otherwise you'll end up murdering them. It's like, no, but it is important to be open about this sort of stuff because, like I explained earlier. After carrying out the murders, he then stayed home with the decomposing bodies for around 2 weeks while sending texts to relatives explaining that everyone was feeling sick. He then used Megan's phone to send further texts to relatives, which made bewildering observations about the impending apocalypse well over a week after his wife was already dead. He may well have been left in the house with the bodies for a considerably longer period of time if the federal agents hadn't made their move on January 13th. We have to remember that the discovery wasn't made by local authorities or police officers acting out of concern for the family. It was made on that day because federal agents wanted to nail Anthony Todd for fraud. Anthony's relatives have since vented their frustrations that things may have been different if the local authorities had taken their earlier concerns more seriously and made more effort to assess the house on their initial visit on December 29th. It's impossible to know for sure, but as the Todds had already fallen silent by that time, I strongly suspect that it would have already been too late. Yeah, but also, why didn't one of the family? They seem to have 2,500 people join that Facebook group set up by the family. No one wants to go down to Celebration and check on them? I know America's big, but come on, make the trip. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, Anthony Todd was arrested and faced an initial interrogation by detectives, which was put on hold when he had to be taken to hospital after revealing that he had overdosed on Benadryl in a bid to take his own life. He was released 2 days later. As the Shatter community of Celebration gathered to hold a candlelit vigil for the victims, Anthony Todd was placed under further interrogation. During this early questioning, he made several confessions to the murders, although his version of events would change quite dramatically before he faced trial. Anthony, I think we could just call him Todd from this point onwards, originally told detectives that Megan's health had been seriously deteriorating and she'd reached a point where she believed that the family had been cursed with bad karma and that the only way forward was for all the family to seek reincarnation in a new and better life. Bro, this is some crazy defense strategy. Todd had apparently agreed with his wife that the only sensible option left on the table was for the family to die, and as the man of the house, he felt it was his duty to see this through to the end. There didn't appear to be any mention of Benadryl in the first confession. Todd claimed that Megan actually stabbed herself, and he later stepped in to suffocate her with a pillow and release her from the agony. He then stabbed Alec and Tyler before suffocating Zoe with a pillow. One of the oddest things about the original confession is that Todd only begins to show any visible signs of emotion when discussing the death of the dog Breezy. What the fuck, bro? He appears to be chillingly cold, methodical, and detached when revealing how exactly he murdered his wife and young children. But when discussing the death of Breezy, he dives into quite extraordinary detail about how he wrapped the dog in a Mexican blanket and gently pinched his nose to ensure that Breezy died in the most peaceful way possible. Bro, the most peaceful way possible is not being fucking suffocated. When the detective suggests that Breezy was also stabbed to death, Todd suddenly becomes remarkably agitated and seems to find it deeply offensive that anybody could dare accuse him of stabbing a dog, despite the fact that he'd literally just calmly explained how he'd stabbed his wife and own children, whilst barely expressing the slightest flicker of emotion. Todd also revealed how he had planned to kill himself afterwards in various different ways, but had ultimately chickened out of going through with it. Instead, he stayed with the bodies and just very occasionally left the house to stock up on food whenever he felt a bit peckish. His story changed quite a bit over the course of the 3 separate confessions, something he put down to the fact that during the original confession he was still out of his mind on Benadryl. Well, it had been 2 days. He'd been released from hospital, so I don't think so. At one point, he claimed he couldn't even remember how exactly his family died, nor could he remember making the original confession. He also claimed that the real catalyst for the deaths was not so much his wife's health battles and her wild dreams of reincarnation, but more to do with how both of them had agreed to a death pact to escape the horrors of the imminent apocalypse. They originally hadn't planned to kill the children, but when it was calmly explained to the kids that the end of the world was nigh and that their parents intended to take their own lives, Todd claimed that the kids begged to die with them. Yeah, but they're f***ing kids. They don't understand. You could fuck right off with that. Although this guy does seem properly mentally unwell. However, as Todd awaited trial for first-degree murder, his recollection of events gradually twisted into something else entirely, which bore very little relation to the accounts he'd originally given to detectives. It's not clear when exactly Todd reconnected with his father, Robert, but they were certainly back in regular communication following Todd's arrest. And it's in one of Todd's letters to his father, written around 6 months after the murders, that we first begin to see just how much his story had changed. During the course of an incredibly long and rambling letter, Todd claimed to be 10,000% innocent of the preposterous charges cooked up by a sheriff whose office were chasing a big win. He also said he was keen to correct some of the lies that were being perpetuated by the creative writing machine, which is presumably a reference to the press. He wrote, "The media and sheriff's department here are making me out to be the next butcher of Baghdad. I would have called a press conference months ago, but I was told by my attorneys, who happen to be some of the best in the state, that this was not the appropriate way to handle the case." While addressing the death of his children, he initially gives the brief explanation. Long story short, she gave them Benadryl pie, separated them, stabbed them, and then suffocated each one. At the news of this, I ran to the bathroom and puked. I was weak. It's interesting to note Todd's peculiar and possibly inappropriate language in just those few short sentences. Often described as quite a boastful character, I find it fascinating that a man who is clearly skint and appears to be fighting a pretty hopeless case takes the time to tell his father that he somehow managed to secure the services of the best attorneys in the state. It just, like, the super cold thing, I can't tell whether this guy's just a full-on psycho, like murdered his family in cold blood, or whether he is desperately unwell. Maybe it's just me, but I'm also a bit troubled by the phrase long story short. It just seems quite perturbing that when a man is about to explain the circumstances that led to the deaths of his 3 children, he should kick off with a casual, "Well, long story short." As it turns out, we can judge by the long-winded nature of the letter that Todd really wasn't inclined to cut a long story short anyway, and he does eventually go into a lot more detail. He explained to his father how Megan's illness had caused his wife to spiral into depression, yet the morning of the... Oh, she had Lyme disease. I forgot, sorry. Yet the morning of the murders had felt like a miracle, as Megan had woken up completely pain-free for the first time in several months. It felt like it was going to be a good day. Todd later nipped out to get a few things sorted, including the purchase of a Mickey Mouse necklace that daughter Zoe had got her heart set on, because that's the kind of amazing dad that he was. However, Todd never made it home that night because he decided to take a small siesta in his car between tasks and ended up accidentally sleeping there right through until the next morning. Oh, please. Well, he fell asleep in the afternoon and woke up the next morning. Like, I'm a dad. I got young kids. I know that I'm pretty... It's getting better now. They wake up at more reasonable times. But those first few years, it's like, god damn. But I'm not going to fall asleep in my... I've fallen asleep in my car. Like, just parked. It's just, I don't know. There's been moments where it's like, oh, I just got into the shop or something. I just say, hey, I'll wait here. Or, you know, and then just like dozing off. But not sleeping through to the next morning, my dude. That is a weak excuse. Suspecting that he was going to get a bollocking from his wife, he dashed straight home and found the leftovers from the previous night's dessert sitting on the dining table. Todd felt that the dessert looked just as good as any of his wife's masterful culinary creations, but he noted that this one stank absolutely awful. He later found out that it was because Megan had baked a Benadryl pudding pie. He found Megan sobbing at the top of the stairs. She confessed to fatally poisoning all the children with Benadryl pie, and this was confirmed by Todd when he later checked in on the bedrooms of the children. Megan told her husband that she now needed to be with her babies. She drank the entire contents of a family-sized bottle of Benadryl and then stabbed herself in the stomach. Todd then apparently tried to take his own life 8 times, but failed on each occasion. He wraps up his letter by offering his father forgiveness for the traumatic incident in 1980, yet the words, oh yeah, god damn, his father. He paid to have his mother killed, I forgot, god damn. Yet the wording of the forgiveness suggests Todd might not have been convinced that his father had anything to do with the shooting of his mother. He wrote, I offer you forgiveness for not being there to protect us that night, March 19th, 1980. Although we were both not there on our respective nights in question, I cannot forgive myself if I don't first forgive you. Now, without wanting to get too judgmental at such an early stage, it's okay, Danny, we can, I am. This new story outlined in the letter may sound a little hard to swallow, and it doesn't entirely add up. Not only does it completely contradict his earlier 3 confessions, which sound far more plausible, he offers no real explanation as to why he didn't try and alert the authorities immediately afterward instead of just hanging around the house for 2 weeks. It's possible that he may have lost the plot while continuously trying to take his own life with vast quantities of Benadryl, but he still had the capacity to skulk off to the shops every now and then. It also seems unlikely that Megan would have chosen to end her own life by stabbing herself in the stomach. Yeah, isn't that famously a very painful way to die? And there was no explanation as to how both Alec and Tyler had also both suffered stab wounds. Yet despite the holes and lack of logic in the story, this was broadly the version of events that Anthony Todd was sticking to when he faced trial on April the 11th, 2022. Plot holes. The trial got underway at Osceola County Courthouse in Kissimmee, Florida, presided over by Judge Keith A. Karsten. Anthony Todd was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. Federal prosecutors had decided to drop all charges relating to fraud as it was felt that this would only impede and overcomplicate the case, and it didn't seem massively important anymore in the grand scheme of things. No, it doesn't, does it? It is the least of his worries. The lawyer comes in, good news, the fraud charges have been dropped. Wow, that's great news. What about the murder? No, you're going away for that, son. It was originally assumed that Todd would face the death penalty if found guilty, but outgoing state attorney Aramis Ayala decreed that the death penalty would not be pursued, pointing out her concerns over Todd's potential mental health issues. It has to be said, though, that Aramis Ayala never pursued the death penalty in any case as she strongly opposed it, a stance which conflicted with the Florida Supreme Court and caused such controversy that she decided not to seek a second term as state attorney. Before we get to the events of the actual trial, it's interesting to note, or perhaps downright baffling to note, the weight of material that was not allowed to be presented to the jury. Todd's defense team successfully argued that there should be no mention whatsoever of the fact that Todd had been under investigation for screwing medical assistance programs out of tens of thousands of dollars, as they felt that this had nothing to do with the murders. This presented several confusing moments in the trial. For example, while one of the federal agents who discovered the bodies provided testimony, he was not allowed to reveal that the sole reason for his visit to the property was to arrest Todd on fraud charges. He wasn't even allowed to reveal the fact that he was a federal agent. It was also ruled that any references to the state of Todd's mental health on that day after downing a load of Benadryl was forbidden. More significantly, the whole of the original confession given by Todd immediately after his arrest was judged to be inadmissible on a technical fault. While the subsequent 2 confessions could still be used as evidence in court, the original one was now out of bounds after Judge Karsten ruled that the detectives had failed to read the suspect's constitutional rights or Miranda warning in a clear and complete manner before proceeding with the interview. Oh, and one last thing was ruled off limits. For reasons that I'm struggling to get my head around, Judge Karsten agreed with the defense team that there should be no reference to the fact that the name Todd is derived from the German word for death or dead. Well, it's really good that you clarified that, Judge, because that's, I'm sure, something that would be brought up by the prosecution. It's like, and most of all, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we know that he is guilty for his name is literally death, said no prosecuting attorney ever. I'm not convinced that this would have swayed any wavering member of the jury into reaching the wrong verdict, but there you go. I'm kind of regretting mentioning it now in case any of you have now jumped to the rash conclusion that Anthony Death might be guilty of anything. The case for the prosecution, led by Danielle Pinnell, was largely focused on the other 2 confessions in which Todd claimed that both he and Megan had decided that all the family needed to die in order to escape the apocalypse. Pinnell went through the harrowing details of how Todd claimed he had first murdered 4-year-old Zoe by suffocation before moving on to Alec and Tyler, who were suffocated and then stabbed. He then claimed that he had suffocated the dog Breezy whilst Megan stabbed herself in the stomach twice. As Megan's attempts to end her own life hadn't worked, Todd stepped in to suffocate her with a pillow. Todd then remained in the house until he was found by deputies, no federal officers in this court version, obviously, and in the meantime, he sent texts to relatives from his and Megan's cell phones. The jury was given the opportunity to view footage from the final 2 confessions, but there was some debate as to whether they should view dozens of graphic and deeply disturbing photographs of what exactly was found by officers inside the Celebration House on that day. The defense argued that this would not be appropriate, but for once their objections were ignored, although Judge Carsten urged the media not to reproduce the images that were being inflicted on the jury and gallery. The defense largely rested on the testimony of Anthony Todd himself, who claimed that he had initially only been trying to cover for his dead wife during those original confessions. He told the jury of how Megan used to be a strong and vibrant woman, but her health issues and subsequent depression had led her to the point where she began studying a Hinduism-based religion, after which she became convinced that the family could all be reunited in a better, healthier life once they had left this particularly cruel and painful world. His testimony in court largely mirrored the version of events that he outlines in the letter to his father, Robert, but with a few significant differences to the constantly evolving story. He now claimed that when he returned home, Megan's shirt was already drenched in blood, possibly a new angle to quietly infer that Megan had stabbed the two children, although Todd now insisted that he had no idea how the children died and there didn't appear to be any mention of Benadryl pudding pie in court. Megan then passed him a lengthy suicide note whilst informing him that all the children were dead before stabbing herself twice. Apparently, Todd's immediate reaction was to yell out of the window for help, but none came. Then he frantically tried searching for a cell phone to call for emergency services, but Megan had hidden all the phones in the house. He ultimately decided he wanted to join the rest of the family, so he attempted unsuccessfully to overdose on Benadryl 8 times. Now, the suicide note is a new addition to the story. If this could have been located and the handwriting been identified as Megan's, this could have potentially helped to boost Todd's defense. Yeah, but it's not. They're not going to find it, because it's not real, is it? Allegedly. And here's a surprising turn of events. Todd was indeed able to produce a copy of the suicide note. Holy sh**. What? One minor snag, though, it wasn't the original handwritten version of the note. It was an edited version that Todd himself typed up after the original was damaged. Oh, come on! Come on now! The note is ridiculous. This guy, I am questioning his sanity. That's an insane thing to believe that could possibly have any impact. The note declared that the Todd family was seeing the end of the world prophecy come true and that Megan was unwilling to have our family suffer and be subjected to foreseen tortures, cataclysmic demise, and continued agony. On a more personal level, the note discusses the death of Megan's father, who took his own life in 2002, and reveals the anguish of her ill health, miscarriages, and battles with depression. Megan apparently concluded the note by declaring that the whole family were united in their proposed act of everlasting salvation and peace. The obvious question here is why exactly Todd needed to type up the note, but he had a typically convoluted answer for that. He claims that the note became damaged when he urinated his pants in the garage during a hallucination that came on after he drank what he initially took for a cup of coffee, but later suspected was a cup of engine oil. What's going on? What is happening? As the original note was now largely destroyed, he decided to retype the whole note from memory because it included a reference to the location chosen by Megan for her ashes to be buried, and he wanted to honor her wishes. But it's clear that a note which Todd admits to typing himself from memory whilst making edits to the original wasn't really going to convince anyone that it had been composed by Megan. In conclusion, Anthony Todd told the court, "My testimony today is the fact that Megan killed her kids and killed herself. I was covering for my wife, obviously unsuccessfully. I had no clue how my kids died." There's another odd choice of language right there, which you may have already picked up on. He doesn't describe the children as our kids or my kids. He describes them only as her kids. He does? I had no clue how my kids died. Megan killed, her kids and killed herself, but then he refers to them as my kids in the next paragraph. I didn't pick up on that. I'm not sure if that's relevant. It could just be like I don't know. I didn't pick up on it. I didn't think it was weird. If I did that, I'd be like, oh, yeah, I guess that's weird, but I wouldn't read too much into it. But this wasn't the only thing about Todd's testimony. He was generally perceived to come across as a deeply arrogant, pompous, and sneering human being. It's not going to work well with the jury, is it? His whole demeanor seemed to rapidly change from moment to moment. When he was discussing the deaths of his family, he'd look directly at the jury and sigh deeply, like a hammy actor, whilst wiping away imaginary tears from his face. Yet if this was followed up by a tricky question from prosecutor Daniel Pinnell, he would immediately snap out of it and become visibly annoyed, sarcastic, and confrontational. Whilst the jury got all his attention whenever he was painting a picture of a heartbroken husband and father, he appeared to forget that they were even there when he was busy snarling at the prosecutor. He very much looked like a man who had difficulty during situations when he wasn't calling the shots, a man who struggled to control his temper, and a man who was trying hard to perform to the jury but was constantly getting distracted by this annoying woman who kept asking him awkward questions about whether or not he'd murdered his own fucking family. The defense team, led by Alicia Smith, ultimately argued that just because Todd had originally confessed to the murders, this didn't necessarily mean that he'd carried out the acts. He was merely taking responsibility for them to protect his wife. Smith also pointed out that detectives had done very little to verify Todd's confessions and hadn't really followed up with the gathering of any proper evidence. She told the court, "The detectives took Mr. Todd at his word and said, 'Hey, my job is done.' The state is essentially picking and choosing when they want you to believe Mr. Todd and when they don't. The evidence in testimony has not been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Todd was the one that did these things. There are holes, there are gaps, and there is reasonable doubt." Whilst it's true that there didn't seem to be an awful lot of evidence gathering after Todd's many confessions, there was one piece of interesting evidence later found in the property, or rather several pieces of interesting evidence. Police uncovered empty boxes of cherry-flavored Benadryl, all of which were smothered in his fingerprints. And prosecutor Daniel Pinnell took issue with Smith's summary of the case in her own closing statement. She said, "The reason why we're here today is control. The defendant wanted control. There is no reasonable doubt in this case." He's guilty. I have very little doubt in my mind and in my opinion that this dude did this. Whether he was mentally there is another question that I just don't feel is being addressed. This guy seems like, I don't know if he's competent. The right verdict. The trial lasted for just 4 days before the jury retired to consider its verdict. Over a period of just 6 hours, the jury were deadlocked. Whilst 11 of the jurors were convinced that Todd was guilty of all charges, there was one who felt that the prosecution hadn't proved his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In fairness, I'd agree that the police and prosecution hadn't exactly assembled a watertight case in what felt like a very hazy and confusing trial with several important elements missing, a point we'll return to in just a moment. One of the jurors, Manny Lasada, later explained to The Day podcast how the holdout juror was eventually persuaded during an intense and frustrating 6-hour tussle that Todd's explanation of events defied logic. It was also put to the juror that if Todd was found innocent today, a likely murderer would be acquitted and would have permanently escaped justice. But if he were found guilty, a potentially innocent man would still have the right to appeal. This seemed to be one of the arguments that eventually swayed the holdout juror into a now unanimous guilty verdict, although I hope this is not how every jury in the land applies their reasoning. We may as well find this one guilty. He can always appeal if he turns out not to be a murderer. Yes, no, it should work. But the problem is juries can do whatever the they want because that's how juries work. On April 14th, 2022, 46-year-old Anthony Todd was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. Judge Carsten described Todd as a destroyer of worlds, while passing 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole and an additional year for the killing of the family dog Breezy. And whilst it goes without saying that our revulsions in this case are naturally focused on the barbaric murder of a mother and 3 young children, it's quite fitting that the judge took the relatively rare step of ensuring that the senseless killing of a pet dog was not just forgotten. A sentence was passed. Anthony Todd defiantly shook his head to let the judge know that the wrong decision had been reached. He was given the opportunity to make a final statement, during which he reiterated his innocence and his love for his family. As his final statement rambled on and on, it became clear that even his own defense team were now getting a bit fed up with him, as one of his lawyers got up twice to essentially advise his client to just shut the fuck up. But on both occasions, Todd just rudely waved away the lawyer as if dismissing a small child from a grown-up conversation. He seemed to be under the impression that he might just be able to persuade the judge to overturn the jury's decision if he was allowed to talk for long enough. No, you're not going to happen, mate. You're going to prison forever, son. Forever! It's a strategy that didn't quite work, and the last we heard from Todd is that his defense team have filed an appeal. So even if that holdout juror still harbored any lingering doubts, he can rest assured that Todd might be able to have another go. But is there any chance of an appeal overturning the original verdict declared after a trial that arguably failed to paint the complete picture? Todd's father, Robert, certainly seems to be of the opinion that his son is innocent and that there were serious flaws in the trial. He told the press that none of the 3 confessions should have been used as evidence in trial, as his son was not mentally competent during the immediate aftermath of the death of his family and didn't have a clue what he was saying. Some might argue that it was fairly reasonable to consider the very first confession inadmissible, not just because the suspect wasn't fully informed of his constitutional rights, but also because he was subject to apparently suffering from delirium and hallucinations after overdosing on Benadryl, and so perhaps wasn't in the best frame of mind for a meaningful discussion. But I think very few people would argue that every single one of the suspect's 3 confessions should have been just quietly brushed under the carpet, including 2 that he made after he'd been discharged from hospital. Perhaps a more worrying point is that the prosecution did seem to take a slightly lazy approach to the whole case by focusing almost entirely on the confessions. Aside from Todd's fingerprints on the bottles of Benadryl, there was perhaps little else to really go on, as the detectives had appeared to take a similarly lazy approach to collecting evidence. There didn't seem to be any attempt to collect samples of blood evidence or carry out examinations of electronic devices or locate the weapon which was used to stab Megan Alex and Tyler Todd. And I find it hard to disagree with defense lawyer Alicia Smith when she pointed out that detectives just seemed to give up on doing anything else constructive after Todd began making his string of confessions. However, it was also a puzzling decision to forbid any mention of Todd's financial woes and the fact that he was under investigation for swindling tens of thousands of dollars from medical assistance programs. The defense successfully argued that this was not relevant, but I'd have thought it was entirely relevant, as it suggests a possible, or perhaps even likely, motive for the murders. Todd had chosen to kill his family instead of confessing to them that he'd made a complete mess of everything. Instead, the jury were given a somewhat confusing, incomplete, and even downright misleading picture of a man who appeared to have just randomly murdered his own family out of the blue. And the jury were essentially told court-sanctioned lies when they were informed that the bodies were discovered by deputies during a requested welfare check, rather than by federal agents intending to serve an arrest warrant for fraud. I also found it disturbing that practically nobody was bothering to stand up for Megan Todd's character. The defense had argued that an increasingly ill and desperate Megan had become convinced of an ongoing apocalypse from which her family could only escape by taking their own lives and seeking reincarnation. And the prosecution did nothing to suggest that this might not have been true. Members of the jury may well have been left with the impression that she genuinely believed her children needed to die, as nobody had argued against it. And to be fair, that's not really super relevant. They just need to get to guilty. And they did. I strongly suspect that Megan believed no such thing. The only occasions in which her signature gets supposedly attached to the doomsday theory is in a text message composed by Todd after her death and in a suicide note that had been typed up by him. It seems far more probable that Todd had completely fabricated Megan's disturbing beliefs in a bid to give her a motive and shift the blame from himself, but it's a pity that nobody ever brought this up in court. However, despite the failings and gaping chasms of the trial, there can't be that many people who could reasonably conclude that Todd was an innocent man. His bizarre stories continually evolved over time, seemingly in an effort to fit the ongoing narrative, after it had a bit of time to realize that some of the details in the previous version didn't entirely make sense. Whilst he was more than happy to make multiple confessions to the murders during the early interviews with detectives, it seems that he had a change of heart somewhere down the line when he figured he didn't really fancy the idea of spending the rest of his life behind bars. After coming up with the idea that his wife had fatally poisoned the children with Benadryl pudding pie, this angle was swiftly tossed aside when he figured out that it didn't explain the stab wounds on the 2 children. And as his fingerprints were all over the Benadryl bottles, it was better to suggest that he was the one using the stuff during his failed attempts to take his own life. Although there are several implausible elements buried within the passages of Todd's various different retellings of the incident, not least the careless damaging of Megan's supposed suicide note, which Todd thoughtfully retyped, one of the most improbable elements is that Megan chose to stab herself in the stomach twice. It's incredibly rare for anyone to choose such a difficult and painful way to end their life, exactly. But I would imagine it's surely not even physically possible to make a second attempt after the first. I don't know. In rapid succession, there have been obvious parallels drawn between the histories of Anthony Todd and his own father, Robert, as both of them appeared to be living double lives shrouded in secrecy, which ultimately led to them making appallingly twisted decisions. Robert Todd was secretly engaged to a younger woman while still married to his wife, and had at least one other serious relationship on the go. He eventually concluded that he needed to hire a former student to kill his wife and reduce the complications. Anthony Todd was pretending to his family that the financial situation was just as rosy as ever when his business had collapsed and he was under investigation for fraud. He eventually concluded that he had to murder his own family rather than admit that he had failed. Whilst it's tempting to conclude that Anthony Todd simply followed in the dark footsteps of his father, we have to remember that he didn't speak to his father for decades after the age of 4, and I'm not convinced that duplicity and murderous streaks just run in the family blood. What we can deduce from Todd's own performance in court is that he's an arrogant and unpleasant man who very much gives off control freak vibes. He really doesn't come across as a good human. It would appear that he thought it better for his family to die at his own hand, rather than allow them to discover that the control freak had completely lost control of the narrative now that federal agents were coming after him and the family were on the brink of getting booted out of their celebration home. It seems likely that he originally intended to take his own life afterward. But whilst he proved capable of murdering his wife and 3 young children, he wasn't capable of killing himself. And after originally confessing to the murders, albeit while simultaneously blaming his wife with coming up with the idea, he later made a complete U-turn and shifted the entire blame onto one of his own victims. It'll be interesting to see how the proposed appeal pans out, if only to find out what exactly Anthony Todd came up with next time. A brand new made-up story. Just stay in prison, dude. It's where you fucking belong. I'm pretty sure that Walt Disney didn't envision any of this. Oh yeah, this is going on in Disney's town when he first made his utopian community. And although Celebration now often gets labeled as Disney's murder town, it still has to be said that even now the homicide rate is relatively low. Of course, Disney had long since abandoned Celebration anyway, before the real troubles began brewing. But even if they'd stuck around for the long haul, I don't think even the mighty Disney Corporation could have fully controlled what exactly happens in a town after you've started putting human beings inside it, no matter how many silly rules and regulations you compose, and no matter how much music you blast out from the palm trees to sedate the natives. Perhaps the text from that original sales brochure could do with a little update for the next printing, though. There was once a place where neighbors greeted neighbors in the quiet summer twilight, where children chased fireflies and porch swings provided easy refuge from the cares of the day. The movie house showed cartoons on Saturday. The grocery store delivered. Kids got slapped with detention for walking around the corner to school. Local death plots claimed innocent lives. People bludgeoned retired teachers to death with axes. Armed residents took pot shots at SWAT teams as helicopters circled above. And conniving murderers were given 4 life sentences with no possibility of parole. Remember that place? Very nice ending, Danny. And that's where we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed it, why not leave it a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast? That'd be grand. And thanks for listening or watching if you're on YouTube. I'll see you next time.